then you feel criticized and challenged and anxious about those things. That journey through that constant stress, anxiety, and tumult, that is the entrepreneurial experience.
Welcome back to our brand new series of 40-Minute Mentor, your pocket-sized career mentor on a mission to raise aspirations and inspire the next generation of category-defining founders. From purpose-led entrepreneurs to world-class investors and Olympic champions, you'll learn firsthand from today's successful leaders on what it takes to be brilliant, all in just 40 minutes. Today, we're joined by Greg Marsh, former VC investor with Index Ventures turned serial entrepreneur. In 2009, Greg founded pioneering luxury accommodation marketplace onefinestay, which he grew from inception to a global business of over 700 people, and an exit via acquisition by Accor Hotels in 2016 in a deal worth more than £200 million. In 2009, Greg co-founded pioneering luxury accommodation marketplace onefinestay, which he grew from inception to a global business of over 700 people, and eventually exited to Accor Hotels in 2016 in a deal worth more than $200 million. Following the acquisition, Greg stepped down as CEO and chairman after 7 years and has since taught at Harvard Business School and thrown himself back into the founder seat with his latest venture, Nous, the smarter way to save on household bills. I've heard many great things about Greg over the years, so can't wait to learn more about his experience as a serial entrepreneur and his latest venture in today's episode. Greg, thank you so much for joining us here on 40-Minute Mentor. How are you, firstly?
No, all right, thanks.
Good stuff. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. We're going to warm you up, as we always like to, with a few quick fire questions. So please finish the following sentences after me. The most memorable day in my career was when?
The day I got to email the early team members and investors of onefinestay with news about their exit proceeds.
Incredible. I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that later in the conversation. One word others would use to describe me is?
Relentless.
A great trait of a serial entrepreneur. Thank you. My biggest failure to date is?
It's too many to count.
Okay. We'll maybe talk about some of the challenges over time, over this conversation. If there was one thing I could change about entrepreneurship, it would be?
Wish it was more compatible with being a great parent and spouse.
Yes, I can relate to that. I'm sure any other founder listening to this would say the same. It's a constant juggle, isn't it? A battle. Well, thank you for those answers, Greg. We're excited to dive into your incredible CV and story now. But before we talk about life as an entrepreneur, I'd love to find out a bit more about early life, your upbringing. Have you always been an entrepreneurial person?
So I grew up in Northwest London, son of two lawyers. So in many ways, my sort of gradual capitulation to entrepreneurship was an act of a strange kind of rebellion or sort of sedition against that norm of kind of progressive incremental professional attainment. You know, the idea that you do well at school, you get better and better at something until you're not bad at it, and then people pay you on an hourly basis, presumably, for not making mistakes. And in a way, I think I probably would have made an all right lawyer, actually. Runs in the family a bit. My grandfather was a lawyer too. But kind of realized during my teens that I just didn't want that, the whole package of that sense of kind of progressive professional assimilation, and fought against it variously and sort of flirted with more conventional career patterns. I mean, I spent a bunch of time in venture capital before I started my own thing for the first time in 2009. But if we are what we repeatedly do, then I think it's hard for me really to describe myself as anything other than an entrepreneur these days.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, it's a good segue to talking about your time at Index, who are a client of ours and a much lauded VC firm. Do you mind sharing a bit about how you ended up there and what were some of your most important lessons from that time as an investor?
Well, I'd thought earlier in my career that this would be the best of all possible worlds. This pattern of working in a startup. I had a taste of startup life back in the early thousands. I had flirted with venture capital even before that. I had a series of internships at Apex Partners when they were doing venture capital work in the late 90s. But I thought, well, maybe, if I can sort of cut my teeth in, as in product roles, it's business GFX, maybe that would be what I'd need to get into venture capital. I met Danny Reimer back in 2002 when he first started the London office, and one thing led to another, and that conversation matured after I finished up my MBA. So I joined in. There's this great firm. It was a great firm. It clearly is a great firm. Its track record speaks for itself, and the team are fantastic, very, very able people. And I liked an awful lot about that job. I still do. I sort of teach venture capital as a module of a class. I was just doing a session for Imperial College students last week on this. And I say to people that I think if it's an enormously intellectually rich job, you're paid to learn, you get access to very, very bright entrepreneurs, and you get to meet them on your terms. It's a really, really fun thing to do. What you don't get to do is build things. I mean, it's building a firm to some extent, but you're not really. You're an advisor. You're allocating other people's money into other people's companies, and I think the very best investors are accepting of that. Maybe one day I'll grow up enough that I'll be accepting of that, and I'll go back to. But I'm probably not professionally used to it now. I probably have seen enough and been around the block enough to be pretty respectably good at it, but that sense of wanting to build things with your bare hands and do it in a collaborative environment with other people who are brilliant, that experience, I think, is something that you really only get from entrepreneurial pursuits. As I say, the very best investors, I think, are accepting of that. And they know that this is about picking winners, supporting them, backing them, and assisting them, but fundamentally that they're not the stars of the show, that it's the entrepreneurs and their teams who are the ones that really create the value.
Yeah, totally. I'd be interested to know if you feel that experience in VC sort of helped you as you became a founder. Do you feel that working closely with various founders over the years gave you a bit of maybe a more realistic image of what it actually meant to become one, and maybe saw some traits or characteristics or, I don't know, things that helped you get a fast start?
It's a mixed picture. I think I learned a lot about what it was to be a founder by working at this business GFX and in the early thousands, where I ended up running the product side of that business. And, before I worked there, I think I had this idea that successful entrepreneurs sort of were somehow miracle workers, that they could leap continents in a stride and that they sort of were super people. And then you work with them and you realize, no, they make mistakes like the rest of us, and they have good days and bad days, and they're trying their best. I think actually, in a way, actually investing with a really good firm like Index, and there are other great firms out there, it can harm rather than help, because the job of an investor, especially at a good firm, is to say no a lot. In a 199 times out of 200, you're going to say thanks, but no thanks to an entrepreneur. And so you become incredibly professionally skeptical about entrepreneurial endeavor, and you become a very precisely demanding critic of other people's activities. You need to be. But the reality, if you're in a business, is you don't get to say no 199 times out of 200. You've got to make it work. And wherever you are, you've got to look forward and say, right, well, a month from now, a year from now, where do we need to be? How are we going to get there? How do we bend the world to our will? How do we create value out of nothing? And I think that sense of once you're in the water, you just swim, which an investor never really has to do. An investor always gets the option of walking away or backing away, or maybe passing the board seat off to a colleague, or not following on a round. They are, as famously the analogy goes, the difference between the pig and the chicken with respect to breakfast. The chicken is invested, but the pig is committed when you have your bacon and eggs. And I think that the entrepreneur is committed. You're in it. You don't have the choice of exit or the option to walk away for many, many years or decades, even if things go reasonably well. On the other hand, what Index did give me, I think, was it gave me a front row seat. And I think it showed me what excellence looked like, both in entrepreneurial teams, but also in senior management teams. I think I came away with a refined appreciation of just how hard it is to build a lot of value, but also how uncertain even the smartest people in the world are. Nobody knows anything, as is famously said about Hollywood. Even investments that look like a sure bet at the time that you make the deal sometimes go sour, and vice versa. Sometimes it's not your winners that end up winning. So I suppose the point is it teaches a certain kind of reflexive humility. It teaches patience. It teaches critical discrimination and analytic rigor. But what I'm afraid I don't think it teaches is that school of hard knocks, emotional resilience that you need actually to succeed in entrepreneurial endeavor.
No, that's really, really interesting. Well, you ultimately went on to found One Fine Stay, which went on to becoming hugely successful. But before we talk about the exit and learnings from that, where did the original idea come from? And what were some of the biggest learnings for you early on in that journey of entrepreneurship?
So I mean, the idea for One Fine Stay came from my own experience of traveling, and often to places with, very bland hotels. This was an era before Airbnb was ubiquitous. So it wasn't a context where, there was a sort of an apartment on every street block. And I had the opposite experience actually at central London, where index offices were, when I went into work every morning and came back often quite late at night, just full of these empty properties, and the lights weren't on because nobody was home. And this sense somehow that as a guest or as a tourist, I have this mediocre experience staying in bland hotels, and as a not that I was at the time, but here are these property owners in the nicest parts of the nicest cities in the world who find their properties are often vacant for long stretches because no one's doing the hard work for them. And folks who own fancy houses and apartments in city centres don't necessarily want to become part-time, rental managers. That's not something they're interested in. Gradually over time, as Airbnb has scaled, so this ecosystem of third parties providing those management services has started to emerge. One Fine Stay essentially was an attempt to vertically integrate all of that in anticipation of the need, as particularly families express it, to have a more controlled, curated, and quality assured travel experience. It was and is an almost ludicrously complex operating business. And so it looks from the outside like a sort of curated marketplace with a bunch of nice photography. The reality inside the business, to give you a sense of its complexity, by the time we sold it in 2016, had about 700 people in the company. It was a hugely intricate operations dance where you had to welcome people to a city, you had to show them around, you had to manage and service these apartments. I think at some level, I knew intellectually, I realized that there was likely to be that degree of complexity or some degree of complexity to scaling and operating. I think I underestimated just how hard it would prove to scale some aspects of that operation, how complex and difficult it was to build kind of people and process service systems around that kind of intense operational complexity. But yeah, at the outset, I remember very vividly thinking this should exist. Someone should have built this. If it existed, I would use it on both sides of the market. So surely someone must have done. I remember being held up in 2009 by that thought. There's an old joke about, why doesn't the economist pick up a £10 note on the pavement in front of them? And the answer is because in equilibrium, someone else has already done it. And I think that what's behind that joke, especially here in a venture capital role where you're seeing hundreds of business plans a month, from very sophisticated entrepreneurs, well, someone would have done this. If it was so obvious, someone would have done this. I must be stupid. There must be a reason why this can't work, why it isn't going to work. Or there must be a company doing this already who's going to eat our lunch even if we try. And that got me stuck for about 6 months. I've had 6 months basically sort of sitting on my hands worrying that maybe the reason that no one had done this was because it was stupid or because I just didn't know about a successful business already doing it. And then I finally got off my hands and went and did it. And there you go. You jump in, the water's warm, or at least if it's not, you have to swim hard anyway.
Indeed. And it became a huge success. I mean, I think I heard you previously say in an interview that one piece of advice you'd give your younger self was to build more of a network around you, as it's a very entrepreneurial existence, entrepreneurship at times. And I know that as a solo founder of 11 years. So do you mind elaborating on that point? And particularly for any aspiring or early stage founders sort of going through the grind right now, particularly solo founders, first time founders, what advice do you have for them?
Well, yeah, let me correct the record for the avoidance of doubt. This was not a solo endeavor. I mean, I talk about 700 team members, but there was also a co-founding team. I only started One Fine Stay. Really, in my mind, it went from, is this a good idea? Could I do it? To, we're going to do this. I remember very vividly when I had a coffee meeting in the cafe lobby of the Royal Festival Hall on the South Bank with my sometime colleague and former boss, Demetrius Zappos. And it was when he said, this sounds like a really interesting idea, that suddenly it clicked. Actually, if he's willing to do this with me, I can see how this can be done. He was more experienced. He's an older, wiser, I don't want to call him too old. He's not much older than me, but he was nevertheless an older and wiser head than I had at the time. And I kind of didn't back myself to build this on my own. So I don't want to imply in anything I'm saying that this is some sort of, solo mission. It's not. Entrepreneurship is a profoundly collaborative endeavor, whether you're doing it with co-founders or just with team members. If you're on your own, you're a plumber or you're a dentist, but you're not really building a product-led business. The point you allude to, and I have said this before, and I believe it to be true, if I look back on what I found hard, and goodness me, there are many hard things about the entrepreneurial pursuit, but what I found hard about it was that sense that often, for extended periods of time, you feel as if the chances of failure and the chances of success are in the balance. There are days when you wake up and think, this is it, we're going to be the next Google. And then you wake up the next morning and it's like, it's all over. We're going to fail. There's no two ways about it. The reality is neither of those things is true. Something in the middle is probably going to be what happens. And what that could mean might be a sort of slow path towards failure. It could be a gradual path towards success, somewhere on that line. But the chances of it ever being a slam dunk overnight success or a total catastrophic failure are actually much lower than our sort of overactive imaginations and our stress response might lead us to believe. The game is to manage yourself. And managing yourself is really easy. Managing your own reactions to that level of anxiety and risk. It's a very easy thing to say. It's extremely hard to do. So one way to ground yourself is by distracting yourself. Go read a book, go see your friends or family, and that works up to a point. But when you're really in the midst of it, when you're in the maelstrom, when you're in the melee, it's very hard just to have detachment. The other thing I think is a certain kind of relationship that you can form. If you invest in it, it doesn't come for free, but you can form with your co-founders if you treat them as equals and there is mutual respect there. That takes a huge amount of the load off your shoulders. You can say honestly, how are you feeling about what's going well? How are you feeling about what's going badly? And even if you're just talking to think, I found both at One Fine Stay and now for my new business, I found that helps enormously. The second thing is you can build a network around you of other typically entrepreneurs. I mean, I wouldn't say that you have to have been an entrepreneur to be able to be in that kind of privileged circle, but it helps. The problem with seeing folks like investors and other professionals around the business as somehow being people to whom you can really express that vulnerability, that uncertainty, that anxiety, and really sharing the successes, is that they're judging you, they're evaluating you in a way that quite often what you need someone to listen, empathize, and perhaps problem solve. And that requires you to open yourself up. It requires you to say, I don't know what we should do now. I'm not sure if we're going to succeed. I don't know if I've made the right decision. I worry that we might have got X wrong or Y wrong, or I have a secret feeling that, so-and-so isn't up to the job, or maybe I'm not up to the job, right? Those kinds of anxieties and those thoughts, you've got to find a way of exploring those in a safe environment. People find, YPO or other environments to do that in. I found at One Fine Stay, for instance, my co-founding team, but then also a bunch of entrepreneurs, some of whom I met through index ventures and some through other activities, proved really valuable to me. It was those relationships. It was going for lunch with, Richard Morris, the founder of Nous.com, who, I just say, I'm having a really bad week. Here's why. And he'd listen and he'd go, yep, it's a really bad week. Maybe there's something you can do. Maybe it's just to listen. Your family and your non-business friends can provide some of that empathy. But the reality is, at least my experience of married life, and I talked to a lot of other entrepreneurs about this, is there's only so much of it your spouse can really put up with, right? They've got to deal with all the other things that are being married to you involved, but also that person's got to deal with your ups and your downs and your stress response and your mood, and imposing upon them also the obligation to be your therapist and your business coach and your mentor, as well as your life partner and perhaps the mother or father of your children. It's too much to ask of anyone. And so I think one of the bits of advice I often give entrepreneurs is, yes, build a relationship, build a network around you. Don't assume that one person can do all this for you. Don't impose that on them. And certainly don't assume that you can do it all by yourself. I mean, I've never met an entrepreneur who can cope with all that uncertainty, complexity, and stress and risk entirely on their own.
It's such important advice. I'm really glad that you shared that. Even last week, Sifted released an article saying 49% of founders considered quitting their startup last year.
Well, and 51% are deluded or lying. I mean, everyone goes through highs and lows. Everyone does. And the gap between success and failure, it is not that, if you're in a winner, you know it and everyone knows it. It's not as simple as that. What actually happens when you take on a bunch of capital, when you take on more risk, you get more ambitious with that. And so you set your expectations there and you don't hit your expectations. You miss the expectations, or you miss them in some dimensions, and you feel criticized and challenged and anxious about those things. That journey through that constant stress, anxiety, and tumult, that is the entrepreneurial experience. It is hard for everyone who goes through it, at least in my experience. Every entrepreneur will tell you that. Behind closed doors, it can be brutally hard. And there are times when you think, my goodness, I'm failing. And there are times when you think, I am on top of the world, and everything in between.
Yeah, all the more reason to create that network and reach out to other founders and share the experience. I found it in a founders group that I'm in. It's unbelievably helpful. Just to almost, it's almost like group therapy, but it really does help. I've had the pleasure of meeting a number of ex One Fine Stay alumni who have gone on to become brilliant operators, founders. So I did want to ask you, what was it about your culture, your business, that one made you so successful as a company, but also created so many of these great operators? Was there a secret sauce that other founders can tap into?
There's an irony, isn't there? I think, by the way, just to pick up on your question, I think we were quite successful. I don't think we were wildly successful as an outcome of the business. It was a good, successful outcome. We sold the business for about 200 and a bit million to Accor Hotels, the French group. It was a good, respectable outcome. And the brand not only survived, but has thrived under their ownership. They've changed the model around a bit and they've made their own mistakes. That's fine. That's their job. But, I think it's great to see it has had an afterlife and it's continued. As an investment, right, for the investors in the business, it was a modest success for some of them and a big success for the early ones. It by no means was a sort of slam dunk outcome. So it's just really interesting to compare the difference between the extent to which the brand is successful and many of the early team members made money out of it, and indeed many of the early investors made a lot of money out of it, and the extent to which, this ain't kind of I was about to say Figma, but Figma is perhaps a bad example given the regulators have kiboshed the acquisition. So I still take hiring ridiculously seriously. I think it is the most important thing that a company does. How you hire, who you hire, how you select, and then once you've hired, how you enable, empower, and if necessary, or performance manage or terminate. I think that set of activities is right at the heart of every really successful business. And I'll go further than that. I challenge anyone listening, and I'm happy to be corrected if someone can come up with a good counterexample of this. I challenge anyone listening to name me a truly successful business over the long term that did not have a truly distinctive culture. Now, why is that? It is partly because at a fundamental level, culture is a sorting function. A culture is something which is a beacon out into the world. It says, if you are this sort of person, you will thrive here. Your job as a business, I think, is to create and sustain that culture, to make it feel true, to project that culture in an authentic way out through your recruitment activities, your brand behavior, and so on. To make sure that when you're interviewing people, that they see and feel that culture as authentically expressed. Some of them will opt in and they will get, hopefully, a taste of that and the experience of that culture as part of their work. Some will not want it, and that's as it should be. I mean, think about truly successful businesses that have very distinctive, sometimes Marmite cultures, right? I mean, Goldman Sachs, would you enjoy working at Goldman Sachs? Well, you might not, but some people really do. And the ones who do enjoy it thrive there. And it's one of the reasons it's such a successful business. It's such a distinctive, and again, not a culture that appeals to everyone by any stretch. But I could say the same about Google. I could say the same about any of these companies. They have a very, very strong internal culture. How you hire, who you hire is partly about projecting that culture and then making sure that you are choosing people from among those who are interested, the ones who really want that package of challenge, of experience, of that set of colleagues. Coming back over here, I just came around the block to do this interview, but just leaving the office as I did so, there was a team of 12, 13 people all sitting around a communal dining table having lunch together. I've never sponsored the process of there being communal lunches at work. It was never something we decided to do. The team just did it. And it's become an integral and authentic expression of the culture at Nous, for instance. And I think it's great. I really like that. And there's not decisions you make as a manager. You could get in the way of it. You could say, no, I don't want you all to eat together at lunch, get back to your desk if you were very churlish. The reality is that if people enjoy spending time with their colleagues, if they're challenged and stimulated by the work that they're doing, if they feel they're surrounded by able, smart, motivated, and driven people, they will do their best work. Mm-hmm. We all do, but motivated people want to be surrounded by and attracted by the opportunity to work with other motivated and able people. So I think if we got one thing right at One Fine Stay, if we got one thing right, it was that relentless focus and interest in cultural development and brand around culture and in hiring, who we hired and how we hired. So we tried to create something that was special. And I've had lots of positive feedback about it over the years. I wouldn't say I knew that we were getting it right at the time, but I would say I have focused as relentlessly on that set of decisions in building another business second time around. I think it is the most important set of things you do as an entrepreneur.
Yeah. That is music to my ears as a headhunter. So thank you for saying that. And I've completely seen how those that get it right and take it seriously tend to be the most successful and attract some of the best talent. It's a great segue into talking about Nous. We've had a lot of founders on this podcast that are adamant they will never start another business again because it is tough, but you're onto your second startup now. So first you wanted to start, why go again after, having a big exit? You've had a, very successful career already. Why go again? And where did the idea for Nous come from?
I'm clearly a glutton for punishment, aren't I?
Clearly, yeah.
I wasn't sure the moment I sold One Fine Stay that I was going to go around again. I had a few years to recuperate and reflect on that. And I did sort of lots of other things. I sometimes joke that it was I'm a slow learner. And, I tried a bunch of throwing mud at lots of different walls. I went and taught. I went to HBS and taught entrepreneurship for a bit. I did a bunch of government-y stuff. I went back into investment for a bit. I did some charity stuff. I even tried directing. I mean, it's one thing I've always wanted to do in my early 20s. I wanted to direct plays and things. And I got the chance to help direct a production of Tosca, the opera. I mean, fun, crazy stuff like that. I think if I found my true one and only vocation in any of those activities, I probably wouldn't be back in the hot seat at another startup. But I really envy people who have a vocational calling. My sister's a doctor, and she always knew she wanted. She's about 7 or 8. She's like, I want to be a doctor. And there she is. She's a very, very able doctor. She did brilliantly in medical school and went on and became a pediatrician, then a GP. And she is, I think, pretty fulfilled in that career choice. I have never had any sense of what I'm really meant to be doing when I grow up. And so in the absence of that clarity and vocational calling, I've sort of decomposed it, and I found myself looking for that combination of working with a group of people in a collaborative endeavor, building something that I'm proud of, doing something that has worldly impact. I don't just want to do this in the abstract or, just do something which is entertaining or distracting. I want to do something which affects people's lives in a fundamental way. I think I'm excited by the challenge of building something hard, difficult, complex, but which, if you can build it, really makes a difference, creates something out of nothing. I think that feels very rewarding. So there's a sort of form of sublimated creative activity here going on as well. I'm not sure that all entrepreneurs are very creative people. I think some are just brilliant hustlers, but I think of myself as quite a creative person by temperament. So with those thoughts in my mind, I took a few years to recover, reflected a lot, and it was sort of by about 2020, 4 years ago now, I sort of, I think I probably will do something again. And I started talking to people about what that might be and asked myself the meta question, if I was going to do it again, what is it going to be this time and who is it going to be with? And the what is it going to be had to be more than, making a bit more money or than building something for the sake of building it. It had to be a mission. It had to have purpose to it. And the way I put it is I wanted to live in one place. I don't just mean geographically. That is also true, having previously run a travel business and spent a lot of time traveling around the world, which sounds glamorous until you have to do it for a sustained period of time, at which point you realize it's a mug's game. So I wanted geographically to live in one place. So I live and work in one place. But also I wanted to live and work in one place, metaphorically speaking. I'd done a lot of charity work in the past. I'd done government staff. I'd done all sorts of other kind of bits of work. I wanted to build something which I had no doubt in my heart, if it succeeded, would make the world a better place. Nous is a B Corp. We have a very mission-driven orientation around the belief. We have a strong belief that the way the industry currently works, the way people buy household services like energy and broadband and even insurance products is basically fundamentally broken. And it's a very, very disingenuous business. And a lot of people end up buying things they shouldn't purchase or don't need or are overpaying for things they do need. And we want to fix that. And so we have a sort of pretty strong social orientation around that. The idea that if we succeed at what we're doing, we will change the industry. We will make the world fairer and we'll make people's lives simpler. And that feels like a worthwhile pursuit in its own right. I think that is quite motivating for many of the Nous team members. It's certainly motivating for me. So yeah, there are a variety of factors going into kind of the composition of another go-round. And then the final one, as I alluded to, was wanting to find a group of people who I really wanted to build something with. And Glenn and John at Nous are those people. I have a tremendous depth of respect for Glenn, who was one of the early team members at one point. He was the smartest guy in the room there, and he's probably still the smartest guy in the room now. John, who was a business school colleague of mine, someone who I've known on and off for a couple of decades now and have wanted to work with in the past, but the stars never lined up, and now they have, and it's a real privilege.
Amazing. And I guess for those that don't know much about what you're actually doing at Nous, do you mind bringing the business to life a bit? How does it work in practice, and how can our listeners benefit from it?
Oh, everyone can benefit from it. It is an AI for your household. We save you money on your bills. We find cheaper deals for everything from broadband to mobile, even mortgages and energy bills, and we do it for you. So imagine Martin Lewis in your pocket, powered by AI. That's the pitch. And it works. That's the really exciting thing. As of late last year, when we sort of first started in sort of beta, getting it out there, saving a typical household in the UK probably about £500 a year on their household bills. And now we're rolling that out. We roll it out both through partner employers. So if you run a business, 50, 100, 500, even 5,000 people, we're working with Network Rail, Monzo, the AA, a bunch of really big companies now, as well as lots of small ones offering it as sort of effectively as a benefit to their staff. So it's a really good way for a company to give value back to its employees without just putting cash in their pockets, which is fine, but it gets taxed. So it's not a very efficient way of giving money back to people. And also, this is just a problem most of us have. Most of us don't manage this stuff very well. And we also go direct as well. And so we've done lots of partnerships with sort of media companies like the Daily Mail and others to make sure that we kind of get as broad a distribution audience as possible. So yeah, early days, but very exciting times at Nous.
Yeah, absolutely love the mission. And it sounds like already you're having a lot of success, albeit you have big ambitions for the future.
We have big ambitions, yes.
Yeah, which is fantastic. I mean, it's something we can all relate to as well. So I'm excited to check it out. It is always challenging. You've been around the block and you've already had success before, but doing it again, how are you building this time around? Are there many differences? Are you facing some big challenges and roadblocks that you've had to kind of break through in the first couple of years?
Well, I think many entrepreneurs will identify with this. If you've been in the capital markets at any time in the last sort of 18, 24 months, animal spirits are down. It may well be that in 2024 they begin to recover a bit, but I think those capital market dynamics certainly have a sobering effect. It means that many companies got ahead of their skis and deployed too aggressively, didn't have the capital, the runway to build into their valuations. Valuations have reset. So those things, I think, really focus the mind, and it makes me very sensitive to I know a bunch of entrepreneurs who've had to do gymnastics to make sure that their P&L is going to survive or support them through this sort of tougher period. So that is one dimension, I think, which is challenging. I mean, the other side of the coin, of course, is that it's a great time to hire. There's a lot of very talented people out there in the market at the moment who are not perhaps quite so excited about the place that they have been working and who are looking for a new challenge. I think the other dimension, look, I mean, Nous is a very complex business. It's complex in a different way to the way that onefinestay was complex. Not an accident. The Nous business is a bits and bytes business. Fundamentally, if it works, you can rinse and repeat, and the marginal cost of delivery is pretty low. And we think will asymptotically tend to zero as we deploy things like language models and other stuff behind the scenes to take out customer service complexity at the time. So the early stages of any new business, there is tons of legwork. There's tons of doing stuff that doesn't scale. We've had to do these deals with established suppliers in the industry, and it's amazing how long it takes mid-sized and large companies to make obviously right decisions. I mean, you talk to the commercial teams and someone goes, yeah, I get it, I love it, let's do this. And then 6 months later, you're still wading through the kind of the minutiae of contracts with their legal department, spooling up a lawyer from a big supplier we're working with or will be working with in the next few weeks. But it's just amazing how long it takes sometimes to get these deals done. So yeah, I mean, it's always the rough and the smooth and swings and roundabouts with these things. But
absolutely. I guess that's where your relentlessness is so important to kind of battle through in those long days and those challenges that you have to overcome.
It's not a word that I would have thought of. Actually, it was another entrepreneur who said it to me. He said, every time I hear you talk about business, it just sounds like your culture, Greg. It's like you, it's just relentless. And I thought at the time I smarted a bit and I thought that's a bit of a backhanded compliment. And I reflected on it and I realized he's kind of right. And I do have that quality to me and it isn't always good. And I think sometimes it has, as all these things do, these qualities can be good or bad depending on context. A certain kind of entrepreneurial endeavor does, I think, depend on persistence and resilience. And that absolute determination and refusal to give up and so on, that is part of what success often means. On the other hand, it can wear people down. I mean, it can wear me down sometimes if I'm not careful. And so I think there is a dark side to all of these trades.
Yeah.
And you've got to make sure you're kind of aware, alert to that and able to manage against it.
Absolutely. And one of the areas, and you've alluded to the challenging economic climate we find ourselves in, but one of the areas you do need to be relentless is when it comes to fundraising. It's challenging. And you've done it over many years. You've been an investor, so you have a unique vantage point. And you raised $10 million for Nous from prominent investors like angel investors like Tom Bloomfield, Brent Hoberman. So there are going to be people listening to this that are doing it for the first time or really struggling to get the traction at the moment where there is less money going around. So what tips or advice can you pass on to anyone in that situation right now?
There is no silver bullet here, and I don't want to give kind of pithy generic advice. The pithiest I get is also, the most glib I get on this is, don't raise money at all, right? There are other sources of capital than the capital markets. Your customers are a great source of capital. Think about the working capital dynamics of your businesses. There are ways you can finance cash flows another way. The reality is, if you do have to raise money, if it's a product business that just has a bit of a heavy lift at the outset, there is still capital out there. I think the seed markets and the Series A markets are less tough than later stage financing rounds, and intellectually, rationally, they should be. And the problem is that animal spirits affects everybody and most multi-stage investors because they've been badly bitten on their sort of Series B, C, sort of growth round valuations and deferred exit plans. That affects that appetite to do early stage deal making, even though rationally it shouldn't. I mean, the reason it rationally shouldn't, very simply put, is that you're going to be somewhere between 5 and 15 years from a Series A check being deployed to seeing capital return of any significant volume, if you ever see capital return at all. Over which period of time you have no idea where you are in the cycle at the time you go in. You have no idea where you're going to be in the cycle at the time you come out. So it doesn't really matter what you pay to get in. If the business is really successful, you're going to have a great return. If I say to you, what price would you invest in Facebook? It doesn't matter. The answer is it doesn't matter. If it was going to be Facebook, it doesn't matter if you invested in 50 million pre or 500 million pre, you were still going to make so many times your money. Who's counting? Having said all that, the valuations are down, and so you have to accept that. If you've done previous structural financing rounds, there's just going to be a recap, and it's going to hurt, and everyone's going to scream at each other. And I think back to the psychology of the entrepreneur, so much of what makes that hard is not a rational question. Like rationally, yeah, recap, no big deal. Psychologically, I, as an entrepreneur, let's say, I started a business 5 years ago, right? I raised money on these frothy terms at the height of the market in 2021. I, on paper, am worth 50 million on paper, not real money. And now, after some recap, I'm worth 5, or I'm worth nothing at all because I'm underwater and I have to be kind of re-upped in the option pool. Psychologically, I've got to deal with that. The reality is I was never worth 50 million and I'm not worth nothing today. It was neither of those two extremes were ever actually true, but I've got to take myself on that journey. I've got to put it behind me and I've got to look ahead. And that is unbelievably hard to do. I think so much of this is about self-management and expectation management. Beyond that, look, as a second-time round entrepreneur, you get a little bit of an unfair advantage when you're raising angel money because you've got a network and people are willing to give you a bit more rope for you to hang yourself with. So, we took advantage of that with Nous. I'm not complacent about what the next funding round will look like or the next funding environment. We've got a lot to prove before we go out and ask people to give us more money. We've proven some of it, but not all of it yet. And that's the nature of these journeys. There is still a lot of cash out there. People are still looking to deploy it, but you're probably going to have to kiss more frogs. You're probably going to have to put a very good performance in, and it will be competitive. And let's hope that, the markets improve a little bit and animal spirits return and sentiment ticks up towards the latter part of this year.
Fingers firmly crossed. Before we get to our final 3 wrap-up questions, Greg, I just wanted to ask about your ambitions for Nous for 2024 and beyond. It sounds like there's a lot to do, a lot of excitement ahead. What are the things in the next few months that you can look forward to?
Our vision is we want to help everyone in the world. I mean, certainly everyone in the UK for now. There are 30 million households here. We think 5 to 10 million are directly serviceable and addressable for a product like this. It's not quite all because there are bill nerds, we call them, out there who are really good at this stuff and, read all the Martin Lewis stuff and manage this stuff very assiduously. I'm not one of them. Most people I know aren't. We think it's about 15% of households have a bill nerd in them, and lucky for them. But the rest of us don't. And Nous is your bill nerd in your pocket. It does it for you. So we have a lot of work to do to sort of burn through and penetrate that UK market opportunity and prove it out for the kind of core service lines. And we want to add more service lines to our offering, take more responsibility, manage more of your household for you before we cross the Atlantic and plant flags overseas as well. We think this is a huge opportunity. I think more generally speaking, you can see what we're doing as being a sort of case, an example or a particular specialized industry example of a co-pilot, right? An AI-powered co-pilot, which takes responsibility for managing a class of decision, routine, low-level decision-making that we don't want to deal with for ourselves, whether that's booking flights or whether that's, sorting out your car insurance. These are things which none of us want to do, but they have to get done. And the idea that you could delegate parts of that responsibility to a well-designed agent to operate on your behalf. I think we've all seen the light when we play with general class tools like ChatGPT. We've seen what's potentially possible. The difference between a general class kind of Turing test solution like that and something that can actually reliably make decisions in a particular life domain, that's a big gap. And you've got to have specialized competence and a lot of industry context to be able to do that, which is where Nous has started. But no, our ambition is to be a one-stop shop solution for not only your bills, but all of your life admin in one place. And we're early steps in a very long journey to achieve that.
Oh, well, best of luck with that. I'm, for somebody that is the antithesis of a bill nerd, it's just what I need. So I'm excited to check that out. We're sadly at an end. We've got 3 final wrap-up questions for you, Greg. It's been a genuine pleasure. So thank you again. This is 40-Minute Mentor. So I have to ask, if you could be mentored by anyone, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Bill Gates, who I have a lot of respect for, notwithstanding the recent rather disastrous shenanigans with sex parties and all sorts, and Jeffrey Epstein. He is another relentless entrepreneur, much more successful than I certainly will ever be. I think he certainly was in the right place at the right time in building Microsoft, but I also think the way that he did that, the ingenuity with which he raised capital, not, by the way, from venture capitalists at the early stages, but from a large supplier, IBM, the way that he built that organization and survived several turns and twists in the evolution of sort of emerging computer industry, delivered on that vision to power every desktop on every desk in the world. As a human, I have tremendous respect for his intellect, but also I think his sort of philanthropic endeavors speak for themselves. Can't comment on him as a father and a husband. I think, I'm not in a place to do that. I would certainly take very seriously anything he said to me. Having said that, I've not been a very good mentee. Generally struggled in my life to form effective relationships on the other side of a mentorship line. And I think that's partly about not just seeking it, but also making yourself vulnerable and making yourself and opening yourself to that sort of dynamics of those kinds of relationships. So maybe I've missed my chance with Bill Gates by now, but maybe next time I have the opportunity of forming the right mentorship relationship, I'll be a little bit more ready to make myself vulnerable so that I can really benefit from that kind of interaction when it happens.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that's it's good for others to hear that as well, because I think it does need us to break down the barriers a little bit to really maximize those mentorship relationships. So thank you. We've come to our question roulette segment where we've let our listeners know you're coming on, and they've picked 3 questions. So can you pick 1, 2, or 3, and we'll see what they've got for you.
2.
Okay, 2. Nous helps customers tackle a huge problem navigating the cost of living crisis. What other practical advice do you have when it comes to making your money work harder in challenging times?
Now, I'm not a financial advisor, but in the spirit of this interview, I will say that as an entrepreneur, EIS and SEIS are remarkably attractive schemes and ways of raising money. There are plenty of people with cash in their pocket right now who are looking to deploy it. And if you can get EIS or SEIS status for your investment, it will make it an extremely easy decision, particularly SEIS, for more sophisticated investors, by which I do not necessarily mean professional angels. I just mean anyone who's got a little bit of cash in the bank, maybe parents or friends of parents. On the other side of that, yeah, if you get to invest in EIS or SEIS schemes, maybe friends of yours are raising on those terms, I wouldn't quite say write the check and then ask the questions, but there's a little bit of ready, fire, aim about it, particularly for SEIS investing. It is such an attractive scheme and the write-off value is so significant. It's almost a no-brainer. It's certainly as close to a no-brainer as any of these kinds of investment vehicles get. So ignore tax effects at your peril. Maybe that's the headline for that bit of it.
Thanks, Greg. Brilliant. And final question. What is one piece of career advice that you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
Depends where you are in your journey. Until and unless you've started a thing, if you think you want to start a thing, keep your life cheap. The saddest of all stories is I really want to do a thing, but I can't afford to because I've got a mortgage and 2 kids at private schools, whatever it may be, scale it depending on your life circumstance. Whereas if you'd started a bit early or you'd kept your life a bit cheaper, you kept yourself on your toes, I think you'd have been able to take those shots. So yeah, jump when you can, keep your life cheap until you jump. And then I suppose I can't help but say, brace yourself. It's a long, hard walk up a very steep hill. That doesn't mean it isn't worth climbing. And it doesn't mean that the only success is to get to the top. Just the climb can be its own reward, even if it's not always fun when you're climbing.
It's really important advice to finish this really enjoyable conversation, Greg. Thank you so much. Love the mission of Now. Super excited to see you achieve those big ambitions. And thank you for sharing your story with us today. It's much appreciated.
Thanks for having me, James.
Thank you. Cheers, Greg. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I really hope that you found it useful and inspiring. If we have left any questions unanswered, or if you have any feedback or guest recommendations for future series, then please make sure you get in touch on info@jbmc.co.uk. I often get asked by listeners how you can help us spread the word about 40 Minute Mentor. There are two simple ways you can help. Firstly, share this episode on your preferred social media platform, and LinkedIn is probably where I'm most likely to see it. And you can also leave us a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Every share on social media and review left on the podcast platforms really helps us to get 40 Minute Mentor in front of new audiences and share the power of mentorship even further. Thank you so much for your ongoing support, and I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday for even more pocket-sized mentorship.